"Sir, you need to vacate the premises immediately. You've been evicted." That was the first thing out of the officer's mouth as the HOA board crowded behind him, smirking like they'd already won. The president waved papers in the air, his voice sharp with arrogance. "This man is violating community bylaws. He has no right to live here. Officers, remove him now." I didn't move, I didn't shout. I simply looked at the faces of the very people who thought they could throw me out of my own home. Their mistake was assuming I was just another tenant. Slowly, I folded my arms and smiled. "You might want to double-check your facts before you drag me out." Confusion flickered across the room. The board leaned closer, eager to see me beg. But begging wasn't on the menu. Because what they didn't know was simple. The $4 million resort they lived in, every suite, every hallway, every inch of it belonged to me. And they were about to learn why evicting the landlord was the biggest mistake of their lives. Most people think of a resort as a place you visit for a weekend. You book a suite, order room service, maybe take a swim before heading back to real life. For me, this resort is real life. I don't just live here, I own it. Every brick, every suite, every elevator shaft. The paperwork in my safe makes it clear this $4 million property belongs to me. I didn't always plan on being a resort owner. The place originally belonged to my uncle, a man who saw opportunity in a failing lakeside hotel. He poured everything he had into transforming it into luxury condos and vacation suites. When he passed unexpectedly, I inherited not just his property but his vision. Over the years I invested my own money to modernize it, turning what was once a forgotten building into the crown jewel of this town. Ironically, those renovations are the reason the Homeowners Association ever came to exist. The condo buyers insisted they needed standards to maintain property value. At first I didn't argue. A few rules about paint colors or lobby decorations didn't seem like a problem. But as the resort grew more profitable and the residents more entitled, the HOA board began to see themselves as kings of a castle they didn't own. The reality was simple. These board members paid monthly dues and condo fees straight into my pocket. Without me, there was no pool to fight over, no lobby to hold their meetings in, no resort at all. Yet somehow, the people who signed rent checks with my name on them convinced themselves they had power over me. Their arrogance would have been amusing if it hadn't been so dangerous. I'd seen the petty violation letters, the gossip in the hallways, the way they puffed themselves up in board meetings like politicians on C-SPAN. It was only a matter of time before their inflated egos led to something bigger. I always thought the irony was delicious. They were trying to control the very man who controlled their homes. But that irony turned sour the day their signatures appeared on an eviction notice with my name on it. Because when an HOA board decides they can push around the landlord of the entire resort, they're not just breaking rules. They're starting a war. The first real shot across the bow didn't come from a lawyer or a courtroom. It came in the form of a flimsy white envelope slipped under my door. At first glance I thought it was some resort guest leaving a thank you note, maybe one of the weekenders who'd enjoyed the poolside service. But when I tore it open, bold black letters screamed at me, "Notice of violation." Apparently my balcony furniture was not in compliance with community standards. According to the HOA, the wicker chairs I'd personally selected, the same style used in half the resort, were aesthetic hazards. The letter threatened me with fines and a formal hearing if I didn't remove them within 72 hours. I chuckled at the absurdity. Imagine being fined for sitting in a chair you purchased on a balcony you owned overlooking a resort you controlled. It was like a tenant trying to evict their landlord because they didn't like his curtains. Carl was the kind of person who thrived on power, no matter how small. Short, stocky, and permanently red in the face, he strutted around the resort as if he'd built it brick by brick. In reality, he'd bought his condo with inherited money and bullied his way onto the board within a year. Now, with the title HOA President stitched onto his polo shirts, he treated everyone like they lived at his mercy. To him, I was no different, just another resident to intimidate. I tossed the violation letters into a drawer, figuring they'd blow over. After all, sooner or later Carl and his little committee would realize they couldn't bully the man who signed their property deeds. At least that's what I thought. I didn't know it yet, but the stack of petty notices was only the beginning. The knock of trouble had landed at my door, and Carl Baxter was just getting started. It was a Tuesday morning when the knock came again. Heavier this time, deliberate, the kind of knock meant to intimidate. By the time I opened the door, the hallway was empty except for a thick manila envelope taped to the frame. Bold red ink across the front read, "Final Notice." I peeled it off, more curious than concerned, and carried it inside. The HOA loved their paperwork, but this one felt different. The envelope was heavier, more official, the kind of document they thought would scare me into compliance. Inside was a typed, notarized letter, stamped with the seal of the Willow Shores Homeowners Association. The words were so absurd I had to read them twice just to believe them. Effective immediately, tenant Nathan Hayes is hereby evicted from Suite 4A for repeated violations of community bylaws, including but not limited to unauthorized guests, noise disturbances, improper use of common facilities, and failure to adhere to aesthetic standards. I sat back in my chair, stunned for a moment, then laughed out loud. Evicted? Tenant? These people were out of their minds. How exactly do you evict the man who owns the roof over your head? The sheer arrogance of it made my blood boil. These people weren't just bluffing, they genuinely thought they had the power to erase me from my own building with a few sheets of paper and some cheap ink. I flipped the letter over, looking for some trace of sanity, but all I found was a smug little addendum. Failure to comply may result in additional fines, liens, and legal action. It was almost poetic in its stupidity. The HOA board had convinced themselves they were landlords of a property that I owned free and clear. They mistook my silence over the earlier notices for weakness. Now they'd gone all in, betting their reputations on a lie they couldn't possibly enforce. I folded the letter neatly, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it on my desk. They thought they'd delivered an eviction, but what they'd really done was sign the first declaration of war. Carl Baxter wasn't just some petty HOA president who got drunk on bylaws. His bitterness went deeper, older, like a wound that never healed. I'd known his type for years, men who failed big, then tried to play king on the smallest throne they could find. Before he bought his condo here, Carl had tried his hand at real estate development. A decade ago, he launched a grand project just down the highway. Glossy brochures, billboards with his name in bold letters, promises of a luxury lakeside community. He sold the dream to investors, took deposits from eager buyers, and then it collapsed in spectacular fashion. Construction stalled, lawsuits piled up, and within 2 years the whole thing was an empty lot of concrete skeletons and unpaid workers. Carl declared bankruptcy, walked away, and left hundreds of families ruined. That kind of failure doesn't just break a man, it poisons him. By the time he slithered into Willow Shores, he had one mission: rebuild his empire, no matter who he crushed along the way. And when I inherited the resort, he saw me as the final obstacle to his comeback. Carl had been quietly pitching a redevelopment scheme to outside investors. The plan was simple and greedy: dissolve the resort's original ownership structure, bulldoze half the condos, and replace them with high-end timeshares and a new shopping complex. With HOA backing, he could sell the project as a community upgrade, all while lining his pockets with kickbacks and equity shares. There was just one problem. My ownership deed made it impossible to move forward without my consent. The pool, the conference halls, the lobby, all technically fell under the master property rights that I controlled. Without my signature, no bank would finance him, no developer would touch the project. To Carl, I wasn't a neighbor. I was the enemy standing between him and millions of dollars. That explained the sudden escalation. The petty violation notices, the eviction stunt, it was all smoke to hide his real play. He wanted me gone, stripped of authority, so the board could claim community control and greenlight his redevelopment. What Carl didn't understand was that I'd been in boardrooms far nastier than any HOA meeting. I'd seen billion-dollar deals collapse over a single line in a deed. I knew exactly how fragile his scheme was. I leaned back in my chair that night, eviction notice spread out beside the old resort blueprints. They thought they had me cornered, that their signatures and seals could erase my ownership like chalk on a sidewalk. But Carl and his board had made one fatal miscalculation. They didn't know I had deeds they couldn't touch. The morning after the eviction stunt, I opened my door to find my welcome mat buried beneath a stack of bright orange envelopes. At first, I thought it was some prank, maybe a bachelor party gone wrong. But as I bent down and picked them up, the bold header leapt out at me again and again: notice of violation, 47 of them, in a single night. I carried the pile inside, dumped it onto my dining table, and began flipping through them. If Carl Baxter wanted to annoy me, he was certainly off to a strong start. Pool towel left unattended on lounge chair after 10 p.m. Curtains in Suite 4A are beige, not HOA-approved ivory. I actually laughed out loud. Coffee smell, curtains one shade off. Who in their right mind thought a $4 million resort's value hinged on my choice of fabric? But the deeper I went into the stack, the more surreal it became. Improper shoe storage near entryway. Unauthorized use of pool float shaped like an alligator. Violation of beverage container guidelines. Visible mug on balcony. I stared at the last one in disbelief. They were fining me for drinking coffee on my own balcony. Carl had weaponized the HOA rulebook, and he was firing it at me like a machine gun. The image of Carl in his HOA polo shirt, flashlight in hand, scribbling down infractions while the rest of the world slept, was almost comical. Almost. But beneath the comedy was something darker. He wasn't just embarrassing me, he was building a case. A paper trail he thought could convince a judge or bank that I was unfit to manage the property. A strategy designed not to fine me, but to bury me in so many technical violations that his redevelopment plan would look necessary by comparison. I ran my hands through my hair, the laughter gone now. 47 violations in one night. At this pace, I'd have hundreds by the end of the month. And though the fines meant nothing to me, I could buy and sell the entire board twice over. It wasn't about the money. It was about power, intimidation, and control. Carl thought he'd found my weak spot. He thought I'd crack under the avalanche, pack up and disappear before the storm buried me alive. He couldn't have been more wrong. I gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, and slipped the whole pile into a binder. If Carl wanted a paper war, I'd give him one, but unlike him, I knew exactly how to turn paperwork into a weapon that cut both ways. Because I wasn't just a resort owner, I was the man holding the deeds, the contracts, and the legal strings Carl didn't even know existed. And I was done playing defense. I wasn't the only one drowning under Carl Baxter's stack of notices. By the end of that week, it seemed like every resident I passed in the hall carried the same orange envelopes tucked under their arms, faces tight with stress. The first to knock on my door was Luis, one of the longtime maintenance workers. He looked nervous just standing there, glancing up and down the hallway before stepping inside. In his hands, he clutched a folder so thick it looked ready to burst. "Mr. Hayes," he said quietly, "I think you should see this. I've been keeping copies." Inside were work orders, dozens of them, with Carl's signature scrawled in the margins. Half the repairs the board had billed residents for were never completed. Landscaping fees, elevator maintenance, HVAC inspections, all marked as paid, none of them actually done. Carl had been signing off, pocketing the difference, and threatening staff into silence. Luis swallowed hard. He told me if I ever spoke up, I'd lose my job and my condo discount, but I can't watch him do this anymore. He's hurting good people. Later that evening, another knock came. This time it was Mrs. Patterson from the third floor. She was in her 70s, a widow who'd lived here since the early days of the resort. Her hands trembled as she set a stack of letters on my table. "They fined me for my rose planter," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "Said it was unsightly vegetation. Carl told me if I didn't pay he'd put a lien on my condo. I live on Social Security. I can't fight him in court. I thought I'd lose my home." Her story hit hard. My grandmother had loved her roses too. I promised Mrs. Patterson she wouldn't lose her home, not on my watch. By the end of the week, the stories kept coming. The Johnson family fined $1,000 for letting their kids draw with chalk on the driveway. A young couple threatened with eviction after Carl claimed their dog was an unapproved breed, even though the HOA's own bylaws didn't mention it. One man told me Carl had shown up at his door after midnight warning him to vote the right way at the next HOA meeting or face unpleasant consequences. Each story was a nail in the coffin Carl was building for himself. Every document, every letter, every testimony added weight to the truth. This wasn't just about me. Carl's HOA wasn't a community organization, it was a racket, a system of intimidation designed to drive out anyone who resisted, paving the way for his redevelopment scheme. I looked at the growing stack of evidence spread across my dining table. What had started as a petty feud was now revealing itself as something much darker. And if Carl thought I was going to face this alone, he was wrong. Because Willow Shores wasn't just my resort, it was our home, and together, we were ready to fight back. The violations were one thing, paper could be shredded, fines could be ignored, but Carl and his board weren't satisfied with just ink and stamps. Within days, they turned their campaign into something ugly. It started small. My guests began complaining that the front desk suddenly lost their reservations. People who'd stayed at my resort for years were told their names weren't in the system, their credit cards mysteriously declined. More than one longtime customer packed up and left, muttering that it felt like the place didn't want them anymore. Then came the parking lot. One morning I walked out to find long, jagged scratches carved across the side of my car. The paint job looked like someone had dragged a key down the length of it, 3, maybe 4 times. A violation notice fluttered under my wiper blade, taped there by hand, unauthorized vehicle parked overnight. I showed the damage to security. They shrugged, saying the cameras in that corner of the lot had been down for maintenance all week. Convenient. The next hit came 2 nights later, when I returned to my suite and found the power out. Not a neighborhood blackout, not even a floor-wide outage. Just my unit, dark as midnight. The fridge had warmed, food spoiled, the AC dead in the Texas heat. Maintenance claimed it was a breaker malfunction. Funny how the breaker had never once failed in 10 years until Carl declared war on me. By then I knew the board wasn't just trying to annoy me. They were trying to break me. Death by 1,000 cuts. I wasn't the only one. Luis, the maintenance worker, confessed he'd been ordered to accidentally shut off my water supply for a day, just to make things uncomfortable. He refused, but another worker caved under pressure. The pattern was clear, sabotage disguised as coincidence. I called the city inspector, hoping to file a formal complaint. He showed up a week later, clipboard in hand, hard hat tilted just so. He took one look at the building, exchanged a nod with Carl, and spent the next hour pretending to inspect while ignoring the obvious. When I pointed out the faulty wiring that killed my suite's power, he waved it off as tenant misuse. That word again, tenant. It was a small thing, but it told me everything I needed to know. Carl had friends in city offices, people willing to bend inspections, delay reports, and sign off on fake paperwork in exchange for favors. The corruption wasn't limited to HOA meetings. It had crept into the very agencies meant to keep them honest. By the time the inspector left, giving Carl a smug handshake in the lobby, my suspicions had hardened into certainty. This wasn't just harassment. This was a coordinated effort to squeeze me out, sabotage my reputation, and clear the path for Carl's redevelopment scheme. I stood in the middle of my darkened suite, staring at the spoiled groceries and the blinking red light of a useless thermostat. The car scratches, the harassed guests, the staged outages, they weren't accidents, they were messages. Carl Baxter wanted me gone, but all he'd really done was prove how desperate he was. And desperate men make mistakes. It wasn't another violation notice. This time, the envelope was plain white. No HOA logo, no signature. Inside was a single document, photocopied and anonymous. Across the top, in bold, were the words "Confidential, Willow Shores Redevelopment Proposal." I sat down and began to read. The memo laid everything bare. Carl Baxter and his board weren't just piling up violations for sport, they were laying the groundwork for a complete takeover. The plan was simple in writing, but devastating in execution. Step 1, declare the resort's ownership structure outdated and invalid. Step 2, force the landlord to sell his stake, citing mounting violations, unpaid fines, and community mismanagement. Step 3, dissolve the master deed entirely, transferring full control to the HOA. Step 4, greenlight a redevelopment project funded by outside investors, luxury retail, new condos, a golf course. I skimmed the budget estimates, millions in projected profits, with Carl and his cronies taking hefty management fees and equity stakes. They'd even included a mock press release announcing a bold new era for Willow Shores. There was just one glaring problem with their grand design. The memo referred to the landlord, the supposed obstacle they needed to push out, as if he were some faceless corporate entity. They had no idea that the landlord was me, sitting in my suite, reading their little coup in black and white. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. Carl had been plotting to buy me out without realizing he'd already lost before the game even started. My ownership deed wasn't some outdated scrap of paper. It was ironclad, reinforced by every renovation permit, every mortgage release, every notarized line my uncle and I had ever signed. Still, their intent was clear. This wasn't harassment for harassment's sake. Carl was desperate to erase me from the picture so his empire could rise on the ashes of mine. The fact that the memo had been slipped to me anonymously made it even more interesting. Someone inside his circle was leaking information. Maybe a staffer, maybe a board member who'd had enough. Whoever it was, they'd just handed me the smoking gun. I read the final page twice. It was a timeline. Aggressive, ambitious, reckless. Within 30 days, the board planned to file paperwork with the county to dissolve the master deed. They believed, falsely, that once they stacked enough violations against me, I'd fold under the pressure. They were counting on fear. They were counting on silence. But what they didn't count on was me. I slipped the memo back into its envelope and placed it carefully in my binder with the rest of Carl's harassment. The violations, the sabotage, the inspector's fake reports, all of it was building into something bigger. Carl thought he was tightening the noose. What he didn't realize was that every rope he threw around my neck was one I'd soon use to drag him into the light. I leaned back, the corner of my mouth curling into a smile. They'd declared war with paper. They thought they could rewrite history with memos and signatures, but it was time to remind them who really owned this battlefield. Time to flip their little game upside down. I'd played defense long enough. Carl's avalanche of violations, the sabotage, even his redevelopment memo, all of it pointed to one truth: he was trying to bury me alive under paperwork and politics. But if there's one thing I learned in business, it's that paperwork cuts both ways. So I picked up the phone. The first call was to someone who'd pulled me out of more than one fire. Rebecca Kane, a property rights attorney I'd worked with back when I was expanding the resort. Rebecca didn't just know the law, she wielded it like a blade. She answered on the second ring. "Nathan, please tell me you're not calling because of HOA nonsense." "Afraid so," I said, dropping the redevelopment memo onto my desk. "They're not just harassing me, they're plotting to dissolve the ownership structure and seize control. I've got documents, recordings, and about 50 ridiculous violation notices to prove it." I heard her sharp inhale through the line. "Send everything. Tonight, and don't engage with them until I give the green light. If they're building a case against you, we're going to dismantle it, piece by piece." That was Rebecca, efficient, ruthless, and exactly the kind of ally Carl had no idea he'd just made me call. My second call went to someone less conventional, David Chen, a property surveyor with a memory like a steel trap. David had overseen the renovations when the resort was converted to condos years ago. If anyone could confirm the boundaries, easements, and master deed structures, it was him. He chuckled when I explained the situation. "Carl Baxter thinks he can rewrite county records with an HOA memo? That's rich. Nathan, your master deed is bulletproof. I remember signing off on every line myself. I'll dig up the old blueprints and permits. If they try to challenge you, they'll regret it." By the end of the night, I had Rebecca prepping a legal arsenal and David hunting down certified copies of every document Carl thought he could erase. But I wasn't stopping there. Luis, the maintenance worker, agreed to testify about the fake work orders and intimidation. Mrs. Patterson handed me her stack of violation letters, each one signed and dated. The Johnsons gave me photos of their kids' chalk art that cost them a $1,000. Piece by piece, the community's evidence joined mine. I spread everything out across my desk until the surface disappeared under a mosaic of papers. Each violation, each memo, each testimony was a thread. And together, those threads were starting to look like a noose. Not around my neck, but Carl's. Rebecca texted me just before midnight. "Start keeping a log. Every violation, every conversation, every piece of correspondence. We're not just going to defend you, we're going to prove harassment, abuse of authority, and fraud." Her confidence was contagious. For the first time since this started, I felt the tide shifting. Carl thought his paper war would grind me down. What he didn't realize was that every absurd notice, every forged report, every midnight stunt was building my case. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the stack of evidence glowing under the lamp. The board thought they were clever, tightening the net around me. But the truth was simpler. I was the one setting the trap. And soon they'd walk right into it. I wasn't alone. The first call I made was to Rebecca Kane, the sharpest property rights attorney I knew. She and I had worked together back when the resort was first undergoing renovations. Rebecca had a reputation for dismantling corrupt HOAs with nothing but a binder of documents and her relentless cross-examinations. She picked up on the second ring. "Nathan, please tell me you're not neck-deep in HOA drama." "You know me too well," I said, sliding the memo across my desk. "They're plotting to dissolve the ownership structure, evict me, and redevelop the resort. I've got their so-called proposal in writing." Silence for a moment, then a low whistle. "Send me everything. Tonight, and from this point forward, don't talk to them without me. If they want to fight in court, we'll give them one they'll regret." That was Rebecca, confident, fearless, and exactly the weapon I needed. Next I dialed David Chen, a property surveyor, an old friend. He'd been the one to oversee the transition from hotel to condos years ago. If anyone could confirm the master deed's strength, it was him. David laughed when I explained Carl's scheme. "He wants to dissolve your ownership? Nathan, I personally stamped those documents. They're ironclad. Every easement, every boundary line is tied to your deed. I'll pull the certified copies. If they try to challenge you, they'll look like clowns." By midnight I had Rebecca preparing legal filings and David digging through archives. Piece by piece, the fortress Carl thought he was building around me was turning into a cage for himself. But I wasn't relying on professionals alone. The residents were tired of Carl too. Luis, the maintenance worker, gave me copies of fake work orders Carl forced him to sign. Mrs. Patterson handed over her stack of violation letters, trembling but determined. The Johnsons showed me photos of their kids' chalk drawings that cost them a $1,000 fine. Each story added weight, each document added credibility. I spread everything across my desk. Violation notices, memos, testimonies, the surface disappeared under a patchwork of Carl's corruption. To anyone else it might have looked chaotic. To me, it was strategy. Each absurd fine, each act of sabotage, each memo was another brick in the wall I was building, not to defend myself, but to trap him. Rebecca's late-night text came through. Keep a detailed log, every notice, every encounter, every word they say. We'll frame this as harassment, abuse of authority, and attempted fraud. Courts eat that alive. Her confidence steadied me. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt in control. Carl thought he was tightening the screws. What he didn't see was that every move he made was evidence, proof of his desperation, his corruption, his greed. I leaned back, letting the weight of it sink in. He thought he'd cornered me with paper and intimidation, but the truth was simple. I was the one laying the trap. And soon Carl Baxter and his entire board would step right into it. The HOA meeting was supposed to be routine, but Carl had turned it into theater. Word had spread fast, and by the time I walked into the resort's conference hall, every chair was filled. Residents whispered in tight clusters, clutching their own violation notices like confessions at a trial. At the front of the room, Carl stood behind a podium, his board flanking him like a jury he'd already bought. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carl announced, voice booming through a cheap microphone, "thank you for attending this emergency session. We are here tonight to address a serious threat to our community, the repeated violations and misconduct of one resident, Nathan Hayes." The words hung in the air, followed by a ripple of gasps and murmurs. I slipped quietly into the back row, folding my arms. Let him talk. The longer he spoke, the more rope he gave himself. Carl adjusted his glasses, savoring the attention. In just the past month, Mr. Hayes has committed over 50 violations. Noise disturbances, unauthorized guests, misuse of common facilities, even dangerous behavior that jeopardizes the health and safety of this entire community. He gestured to the projector screen where blurry photos appeared. Me carrying groceries into my suite, a guest stepping into the pool after hours, a close-up of my balcony curtains. The audience squinted at the so-called evidence, but Carl pressed on. "We cannot allow one man, no matter how entitled he believes himself to be, to undermine the standards that protect our property values." His voice rose with practiced outrage. "That is why this board has unanimously voted to issue an eviction order against Mr. Hayes, effective immediately." The board members nodded solemnly, papers stacked in front of them like holy writ. Carl noticed it too, his tone sharpened. "This isn't personal, this is about law and order. If Mr. Hayes refuses to comply, lines will be placed, fines enforced, and foreclosure proceedings initiated. Our community cannot survive without discipline." He paused, waiting for applause. What he got instead was silence. I let it hang for a moment longer before rising to my feet. The crowd parted as I walked slowly down the center aisle, every eye tracking me like a scene from a courtroom drama. My footsteps echoed against the tile, deliberate, unhurried. "Interesting presentation, Carl," I said when I reached the front, my voice calm but carrying, "though I notice you left out a few details." Carl stiffened, but his smile stayed plastered on. "Mr. Hayes, this is a closed session. You are not authorized to speak." I held up one of the violation notices, flipping it casually. "Section 8, Paragraph 3 of your own bylaws states that any resident under review has the right to attend and respond at emergency meetings. Unless you'd like to admit you're violating your own rules?" The room stirred. A few residents nodded, recognizing the language. Carl's face tightened, his board shifting uneasily. He cleared his throat. "Very well, say what you have to say." I leaned on the edge of the podium, close enough for him to see the calm in my eyes. "You've piled accusations sky high tonight. 50 violations, photos, threats of foreclosure. Impressive work." I let the silence stretch, then smiled. "But there's one small problem." I tapped the eviction notice on the podium, loud enough for the microphone to catch it. "You're trying to evict the landlord." The crowd erupted, gasps, whispers, even a few muffled laughs. Carl's composure cracked for the first time. His hands clenched the podium, knuckles white. And I knew then, the show was only beginning. The silence after my words stretched long and heavy. Carl's smile twitched, desperate to recover, but the crowd was already buzzing. "A landlord? Here?" The board shifted in their seats, eyes darting like cornered animals. Carl cleared his throat. "That's a bold claim, Mr. Hayes, but let's be clear. You are a tenant here, nothing more. This community is governed by the board, and no amount of grandstanding will change that." I reached into my leather binder and pulled out a stack of papers, crisp and neatly tabbed. "Funny you should say that, Carl. because what I have here says otherwise. I laid the first sheet flat on the podium, turning it so the crowd could see. This, I said, tapping the seal at the bottom, is the master deed of Willow Shores Resort filed with the county clerk's office. It shows clear ownership, not by the HOA, not by any committee, but by Hayes Holdings LLC, a company that, as of 5 years ago, belongs entirely to me. Gasps rippled through the room. I flipped to the next document. Articles of incorporation, notarized, stamped, and signed. And here's the corporate registration. You can check the Secretary of State's records if you'd like. Every square foot of this resort, the lobby, the pool, the parking lots you've been ticketing people for, it all falls under my authority. I let the weight of the words sink in. Residents craned their necks, some pulling out phones to snap photos. A few even whispered, "It's real." Carl slammed his hand on the podium. "This is irrelevant. The HOA governs the community." "Not above the deed," I cut him off sharply. "Not above property law. You've been trying to evict me from property I own outright. That's not enforcement, Carl. That's fraud." The room erupted again. Voices overlapped, some angry, some stunned. Board members shifted uncomfortably, one of them wiping sweat from his brow. I held up the final document, the one I'd been saving for the knockout punch. "And just in case there's any doubt, here are the tax records. Every year since my uncle passed, I've paid them in full. If I'm just a tenant, Carl, tell me why I've been footing the tax bill for your homes." Mrs. Patterson rose slowly from the back. Her voice, thin but steady, carried through the hall. "All these years you've been threatening us, fining us, and the whole time you were trying to evict the man who owns this place." Others followed. The Johnsons, the couple with the chalk-drawing kids, shouted from the side row, "We've been paying dues into his property. Where's that money really going, Carl?" The board froze, deer in headlights. Carl tried to speak, but his voice cracked under the weight of the crowd. I let the noise build, then leaned into the mic one last time. Calm as ever, "You've all just witnessed the truth. Every violation, every fine, every eviction threat, it's smoke, because the board doesn't control Willow Shores. I do." I gathered my papers and stepped back from the podium. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief anymore. It was realization. The HOA hadn't just been harassing a neighbor, they'd been trying to evict their own landlord. "None of this changes the fact that Mr. Hayes has endangered this community," he shouted, voice cracking. He's a liar." There, in black and white, was one of Carl's board members crouched near the breaker box, fumbling with tools. Moments later, my suite went dark on the video feed. Gasps filled the room. The video cut to another clip, my car in the parking lot, headlights catching the gleam of a figure dragging a key down the side. When he turned toward the camera, the grainy face was unmistakable, another board member, Carl's right-hand man. The murmurs grew louder, angrier. Carl stammered, This is Dr." But I wasn't done. I clicked again. This time, an audio file played through the speakers, crisp and undeniable. Carl's voice, recorded in the lobby after hours. "I don't care what it takes. Make his life miserable until he cracks. Kill the power, fine him for everything. He'll fold eventually." The crowd erupted. Residents jumped to their feet, shouting, "You threatened him. You sabotaged his home." Another recording played, this one uglier. "If Patterson doesn't pay that planter fine, file a lien. She can't fight us. She'll be gone by Christmas." Mrs. Patterson gasped, covering her mouth, as the room turned on Carl. I let the outrage build before playing the final clip. The nail in the coffin. A meeting between Carl and the city inspector, caught by my microphone hidden near the maintenance office. Carl's voice again, "Don't worry about the breaker box report. Just mark it tenant misuse. You'll get your envelope at the end of the month." The inspector's muffled laugh sealed it. The hall exploded. People who'd been silent all evening now shouted over each other. "You bribed inspectors? You vandalized his car? You lied to us?" Carl's face drained of color. His board members shifted, one even sliding his chair back, as if he wanted to melt into the wall. I stepped closer to the mic, voice low but clear. "These aren't allegations, these are your words, your actions. And now, everyone here knows the truth." The residents no longer looked at me with suspicion. They looked at Carl, with fury. Neighbors who had once bowed to his intimidation were standing now, pointing fingers, demanding answers. The balance of power had shifted in an instant. Carl tried one last time, pounding the podium. "He's manipulating you. This is all taken out of context." But the crowd wasn't listening anymore. The man who had ruled them with threats and fines was finally exposed. I folded my arms, letting the outrage wash over the room. For the first time since this war began, Carl wasn't in control, and the people he'd bullied for years were about to turn on him. The shouting hadn't even died down when the doors at the back of the hall swung open. The sound of heavy boots echoed across the tile, followed by the flash of uniforms. 2 sheriff's deputies entered, flanking a man in a dark suit with a leather case tucked under his arm. The crowd hushed. "Carl Baxter?" the suited man called, his voice sharp and professional. "County Sheriff's Office, we have a warrant for your arrest." Gasps rippled through the residence. Carl froze, mouth opening and closing like a fish caught out of water. One of the deputies stepped forward, pulling handcuffs from his belt. "This is outrageous," Carl sputtered, backing from the podium. "You can't do this. I'm the HOA president." "Exactly," the deputy said flatly, snapping the cuffs around his wrists. "That's why we can't." But the humiliation didn't stop there. As the deputies dragged him toward the exit, bright lights flared. News cameras. A local reporter and her crew had arrived just in time, tipped off by someone, maybe Rebecca, maybe one of the braver residents. Either way, the timing was perfect. The reporter shoved a microphone toward Carl. "Mr. Baxter, do you have any comment on allegations of harassment, fraud, and bribery within the HOA?" Carl tried to shield his face, but the cameras caught everything. The sweat, the panic, the mask of arrogance finally shattered. Behind him, 2 other board members were pulled aside by officers, their protest drowned out by the clicking of cameras and the cheers of residents. One woman shouted, "How's that for property values, Carl?" And the crowd roared with laughter. I stood off to the side, arms folded, watching the spectacle unfold. It was poetic justice in real time, the same community center Carl had used as his throne, now serving as the stage for his downfall. The reporter turned her lens toward me. "Mr. Hayes, as the property owner, do you have a statement?" I allowed myself a small smile. "Just this. Justice has a way of catching up to people who abuse power. Tonight, Willow Shores took its first step toward freedom." The crowd erupted again, louder this time, residents clapping, some even crying. Mrs. Patterson dabbed her eyes, whispering, "Finally." As Carl was shoved into the back of a patrol car, cameras flashing like fireworks, one truth was undeniable. The man who had terrorized his neighbors with paperwork and threats had been undone by the very evidence he thought no one would dare collect. And the whole world had seen it happen. The conference hall still buzzed with voices long after Carl and his allies were escorted out in handcuffs. The deputies' footsteps had faded, but the echo of clapping and cheers lingered in the air like the release of a storm. For the first time in years, the residents of Willow Shores looked free. I stepped back up to the podium. This time, there was no hostility in the eyes watching me, only relief, gratitude, and cautious hope. The thick binder of evidence still sat at my side, but I no longer needed it. The truth was out, and the board's power had collapsed with Carl's arrest. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, steady but firm, "the board that claimed to govern this community no longer exists. Effective immediately, their authority is dissolved. Willow Shores is returning to what it should have been all along, a home, not a prison." Applause erupted, stronger than before. Some residents stood, clapping until their palms must have stung. Mrs. Patterson had tears on her cheeks as she whispered, "Finally," to the neighbor beside her. I nodded toward the remaining board members who had not been arrested but sat slumped in shame at the side of the hall. "Your resignations will be filed with my office tomorrow morning. And make no mistake, every fraudulent fine, every unlawful lien, every threat this board issued is null and void. No one here will lose their home because of Carl Baxter." That brought another round of cheers, louder, fierce. It wasn't just applause, it was catharsis. Years of fear and intimidation boiling over into joy. Residents surged to their feet, clapping, shouting their approval. Someone yelled, "About time," and laughter rippled through the crowd. The sound was different now, no longer nervous, no longer bitter. It was hopeful. Through the glass doors at the back, I caught sight of Carl one last time. He was being shoved into the back of a patrol car, head bowed, wrists cuffed. His kingdom had crumbled in less than an hour, and he knew it. I turned back to the residents. "Tonight, we begin again. Willow Shores is no longer a battleground. It's our community, strong, fair, and free." The cheer that followed shook the walls. Neighbors hugged each other, hands reached out to me in gratitude, and for the first time since this war began, I allowed myself to breathe. Control was mine again. But more importantly, hope was there. The morning after Carl's arrest, Willow Shores felt different. The tension that had hung over the resort for years, the whispered fears, the anxious glances at orange envelopes, was gone. In its place was something almost forgotten, relief. That's why my first act as sole authority was simple. No more secret meetings. No more shadow fines. No more abuse hidden in paperwork. I gathered the residents in the same hall where Carl once ruled and announced the new system. Instead of a board of self-appointed tyrants, I established staff-led committees. Luis, the maintenance worker who risked his job to expose Carl's scams, was chosen to lead property upkeep. Mrs. Patterson, once fined for her roses, now headed the landscaping committee, and her first act was replanting flower beds across the resort. The Johnson kids were invited to chalk the sidewalks again, this time with the community watching and cheering. Their drawings became symbols of what Willow Shores could be: colorful, creative, free. We opened the books too. For the first time, residents saw where their dues went: salaries, maintenance, improvements. The fraud Carl had hidden was replaced with honesty. And when people saw their money was finally building something real, they leaned in, offering ideas, volunteering time, taking pride in the place they once feared. The transformation was quick, almost startling. Yards filled with garden gnomes and rose planters, balconies lit with string lights instead of notices. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years shared meals, laughter echoing across the pool deck. Standing on the balcony one evening, I watched the sunset spill across the lake and the glow of renewed life spreading through the resort. Willow Shores wasn't perfect, but it was finally ours. We hadn't just removed a corrupt board, we'd rebuilt a community. And this time, no one would ever take it from us again. 2 weeks later, Willow Shores looked like a different place. Where orange envelopes once littered doorsteps, now balloons and string lights swayed in the evening breeze. The pool deck was alive with laughter, the smell of barbecue drifting across the water. Plates clattered, children splashed, neighbors mingled without fear of fines or threats. It wasn't just a party, it was a declaration: the resort was ours again. I stood near the grill with Luis, watching as Mrs. Patterson carefully set rose cuttings in vases along the tables. The Johnson kids dashed by, chalk still on their hands, giggling as they jumped into the pool. Music played low in the background, not the sound of defiance this time, but of freedom. For the first time since this war began, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. This wasn't just about property lines or bylaws. It was about dignity, about proving that a community could outlive its tyrants. I raised a glass, catching the attention of those gathered. To Willow Shores, I said. They tried to evict me from my own empire. Instead, they got evicted from theirs. Cheers erupted, louder than the music, carrying across the water. People clinked glasses, hugged, even cried. It was more than a toast, it was the truth. Because Carl and his cronies hadn't just lost their grip on the board, they'd lost the very homes they once ruled with fear. Their liens were void, their authority dissolved, their reputations in ruins. And while they faced courtrooms and headlines, we faced nothing but the future. As the evening deepened, I walked along the pool's edge, the string lights reflecting in the rippling water. Children splashed, neighbors swapped stories, and for the first time in years, Willow Shores felt like what my uncle had dreamed it would be: a thriving, joyful community. But peace has a way of feeling temporary. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the moment. Unknown number, a text. I stared at the glowing screen, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses behind me. The war here was over, yes, but the text was a reminder of something bigger. Carl's downfall wasn't the end.